Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to the art part of Art and Conversation. And I just saw Bruce come in and he turned around and left. He'll be back, I know. I'm Sonia McDowell, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this morning to the art part of Art and Conversation. We have a speaker who really needs no introduction. You may recently have read about him in Lux magazine. He's the featured personality in Lux magazine. If you haven't got a copy, I'm not sure you can get one, but you probably can pick one up at the library. I think they sold out. But our speaker this morning is our chief curator and curator of contemporary art. He's an Oregon native. He's been here for several years. Help me welcome Bruce Guenther.
14 years, actually. And I remember the first time I addressed this group, I was thinking about it this morning, I thought, it was this funny sort of me and the other. And now I'm thinking of you as my peeps, because, you know, we've all gone to the other side, as it were. You know, you don't know when it happens, but you know that one day in the reflection in the mirror as you walk downtown, or on an unguarded moment when you turn a corner, you think, oh my God, that's my father's face. So today I'm going to talk about a man who only reached 54, who pursued a passion and a dedication to sculpture and to a woman, and who in his life's trajectory went from the security of a known place to a new country, which he embraced thoroughly for its spirit, its modernism, its willingness to change and to accept. And the place that housed the woman he became obsessed with, that he loved, to whom he dedicated all of his work. And in organizing this exhibition, it's a sense of a return for us. For longtime visitors, you will remember that in the, you have to be really a long-term visitor, because in the late 70s, early 80s, the museum had an exhibition of Gaston Lachaise. And over the years, his work has been included in our exhibition program in fits and starts. This is the first full survey that we've seen in more than a generation. I organized this with Paula Hornbostel, the curator and administrator of the Gaston Lachaise Foundation, a foundation that was set up when the artist died after the artist died in 1935, and it has the repository and the guardian of his legacy. I better take off my watch. Been known to go on and on this subject. I want to talk about Gaston Lachaise, the modernist. He is a man who is a victim of his biography. I've just laid out in my beginning remarks a bit about his relationship and his passion. It is the marker by which many people know him. It fits our USA Today, Twitter generation's idea of a life. It's you lead it with passion. You do things in a spontaneous and sometimes unthought out way, and you just go for it. And so his life story appeals to many now because it's so singular in its focus and spontaneous in its resolution. But in fact, Gaston Lachaise is considered by many of my colleagues in Europe, in the museum world and the collecting world, as the only American sculptor before 1950 who can stand with Rodin, Brancusi, Giacometti. the only one they would include in an exhibition before 1950, of art produced before 1950, at the Pompidou, at the Tate Modern. And it is because he breaks ground that no one else does in his generation. And he does it in response to America, to the experience of this place and the birthing of modernism, an activity and a time in which he was an active participant. Let's see, I always forget which thing to push. There we go. Gaston Lachaise was born in 1882 in Paris. His father was an ébéniste. He was a master carver of furniture and the boiserie, the panelings of the great buildings of Paris. At age 6, Lachaise was discovered in his father's studio carving a block of wood. He was a prodigy. He was drawn to it. His father encouraged him, and at 14 they sent him to a trade school, the Palissy School, to learn wood carving because they thought he would continue the family tradition of being a master ébéniste, a wood carver. But he was so precocious in the sculpture area of the school, they rapidly decided that he should go to the École des Beaux-Arts. And at 16, he was admitted to the École des Beaux-Arts on the strength of his portfolio, the youngest person ever admitted to the École. He was considered a prodigy. He established a studio at 17 and a practice in which he began to make sculptures in what must be seen as a traditional notion of portraiture influenced by Rodin, Carrère, Bellus, and the artists of the fin de siècle in Paris. He exhibited over the course of his time at the École, and shortly afterwards, some 5 times in the annual salons, his work was accepted. And so it is, we're looking at an artist who has chosen his first passion, art making and sculpture, and who is single-mindedly pursuing his education in the traditional Beaux-Arts tradition, drawing from plaster casts, studying anatomy, learning to model clay, plaster, carve marble and wood, eventually making molds, learning how to make molds and to cast bronzes. So he develops his skill set from 16 to 18, 19. And it is a traditional course of study. He understands the processes of fine art sculpture. At the time, he meets Isabel Dutton-Nagel, a chance meeting at the gates of the École. She's coming, an American woman of French-Canadian descent, married, 10 years his senior. We're going to get the tabloid part over here quickly. He is smitten, but it is a chance encounter, a social collision, as it were. He sees her again along the Seine, walking along the Seine. She is in Paris with her young son, Edward, who is attending the lycée, the school, the American school there, to learn French and to be refined, because her industrialist husband, George Nagel, who stayed home in Boston managing the businesses that would provide the funds for Isabel to live in Paris for 4 years. Lachaise engineers an opportunity to meet her. He asks her to model. They are smitten with each other, and they begin an affair that would last till the end of his life, and a passion for her that would last throughout her life as she managed his career and estate afterwards. This is a portrait of Isabel. It was exhibited in the Salon of 1905. It is a measure of his technique at that point, and I've included it in the exhibition as a starting point for people to think about, oh, this is what we would expect for a sculpture at this moment in Paris, a Paris influenced by Rodin and the great modeling tradition that he represents. And so Isabel and Edward, who completes his study, so she has no longer any reason to stay in Paris other than Gaston. She returns to America in 1905. And she takes, 1904, 1905. She takes Edward with her and two of Lachaise's sculptures, which she then submits to exhibitions in Boston. He decides that he must follow her. Youth, you know, we all remember it, impetuous choices that you live to regret the rest of your life. And he decides to leave France, his widowed mother and sister and brother, and move to America. But as a poor art student and fledgling sculptor, he takes a job with René Lalique to help Lalique create the famous jewelry for Sarah Bernhardt, for the glass models. And so he makes molds and carves glass for Lalique for almost a year and a half to raise the money to go to America to follow Isabel. He lands in America in 1906. He goes immediately to the Boston area where he secures probably a single room occupancy place and starts two things, learning English and getting a job. He finds a job using his skills as a mold maker and a carver with Henry Hudson Kitson, a British sculptor who is working in America and in Boston, doing at that moment this sort of great series of Civil War monuments, generals on both sides of the conflict. This is the Iowa monument at, it just went away, at a major Civil War battleground. There was a great industry at this moment. You know, Lachaise's life intersects history in a very exciting way. He comes to America just as sculpture has its first great public manifestation. It is the 50th anniversary of the end of the war. It is a time when the nation begins to think they need to make monuments to this defining moment of the 19th century at the beginning of the 20th century. And so academic sculptors flock to America, and a whole series of public monuments are raised. You have only to walk the pathways of Central Park or our own South Park blocks with Phimister Proctor, Abraham Lincoln, Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln, to understand this moment at which America decided to memorialize its history. And we had the resources and the finances to do it. And so Kitson develops a large studio. Lachaise goes to work for him, and it becomes his primary modeler and mold maker. This gives him an income which enables him to establish his studio and to begin to work and to pursue his other passion, Isabel. You know, George gets short shrift in this story, as inevitably they do. Apparently, Isabel and George had found a détente, as it were, in which, as often is the case with tennis coaches, language coaches, and secretaries and executive excesses, you find a kind of a balance point. So Lachaise is active in Boston. He begins to exhibit with the independent artists of Boston. He's accepted into exhibitions, their exhibitions. He has work shown at the MFA. He is a young sculptor, a young French sculptor who has arrived in America with all the accoutrement of an accent and a skill set. It's an interesting moment to be in Boston because in 1909, Freud and Jung come to Worcester, Mass. for 3 months, and they are at Clark University, and they are feted by the fledgling psychoanalytic community. It is the moment, I think, when we see that psychoanalysis is accepted in America. They have a major series of lectures and survey, and they become the toast of the intellectual circles of Boston and Massachusetts. Circles to which Isabel and Gaston, in their kind of bohemian relationship, have access. And it's important because, as I'll later make a point, if I eventually get there, that the speed, Jungian archetypes and the notion of the subliminal and the subconscious become very important in the evolution of Lachaise's work and its eventual source of his most radical gestures, which are in the last part of the exhibit. But what you can see here, and I show this deliberately to sort of contrast what was accepted as sculpture in America at the turn of the century, and contrast it even with the small head of Isabel, of Lachaise. You see the difference between the direct modeling of Rodin through Rodin to Lachaise, and then the kind of precision, the almost photographic narrative quality of what was considered and celebrated as important American sculpture. It is a time when the avant-garde begins to define itself in America, when the notions of art disengaged from the photographic and really entering the realm of the experiential, the emotional, the psychological begins to happen. And Gaston Lachaise and the salon that Isabel sets up are part of that. While he's in Boston, and of course Isabel continues to live with George in a leafy suburb of Boston, and the chauffeur takes her into town for her trysts. He's, this is, every curator wants to marry a trustee and every artist needs a patron. It's the way of the world. So we have Lachaise involved in the avant-garde as it was constituted in Boston. Ruth St Denis, one of the great barefoot dancers in America, comes to Boston with her exotic dances of the Far East. Ruth St Denis, who was of course from Ohio or someplace, embraced the notion of trying to make visible and physical and through movement the static sculptures of India and the Far East, to embody, to combine the snake charmer, belly dancing of the Middle East with this kind of sculptural reality of the fest. And she creates a series of dances, not unlike Loie Fuller or Sarah Bernhardt, the early dancers who danced barefoot. They may have began their career as skirt dancers in the burlesque, but they become very rapidly modernist and modern movement. And here she is in her famous peacock outfit, some combination of Worth couture and Egyptian belly dancer meeting historic murals. And she engages Gaston, and he is, I would say, thrilled by the notion of her liberated movement. This is not a woman wearing a whalebone corset. And he sees 6 performances of hers over the course of time. He asks her to model. She becomes a model for a series of small studies he does of a female in movement, not unlike the drawings of Rodin of Loie Fuller, which we have out at the Maryhill Museum of Art here in Washington. And so St. Denis would become a lifelong friend of Lachaise and Isabel, and she would be part of his life in New York when he moves there. And so it is that sense of the Indian sculpture, of the abhanga, the hip shot S-curve of the body, the amplification of the, do we call them secondary sex traits? Of the female voluptuousness, the beating and things. And so Lachaise is inspired by her, and clearly finds in this sculpture from 1915 a voice for both the studies he makes of Ruth St Denis dancing and Isabel. And so it is not the sylph-like woman, Ruth St Denis, that emerges from this interest in ancient Egyptian and Southeast Asian and Indian subcontinent sculpture that Lachaise develops because of his connectivity with Rue St Denis, but it is ultimately the body of Isabel, 10 years older than Lachaise. She's in her mid-30s, a woman who's had a child and who has lived well, and it is the amplitude of that. But notice the beadwork, the draping, the way the clothing clings to the body. It's an important step for him as he begins to find his way in America. You can almost hear the accent as he tries to say, "Good morning," something. And he begins to work on a series of female forms. He has declared in a letter to Isabel, "You are the goddess I seek to express in my work." They wrote over 700 letters to each other, continuously in their relationship. This was not an age of the iPhone tweet. And so they would take out pen and paper, and at some point during the day, there would be a letter. Some point during the week, an exchange of correspondence, a little sketch, a note, an observation, a thought. "You are the goddess I seek to express in my work." And so he looks for paradigms. And interestingly enough, I discovered this the other day, and so I will come back to this. This is Isabel. He takes a series of photographs on the Maine coast. It's almost warm enough for that during the summer in Maine. And I think it's useful because, there is a certain body type that Isabel has. She has a very compressed pelvis. It's a medical condition. There are 4 types. Who knew all these things? 4 types of pelvises. And hers is not the best for having children, but it's pretty good for sculpture because, it's something to think about. They're oval, round, squarish, and anyway. Doctors among you can explain this later. Lachaise is aware of monumental female sculptures, not only from Greco-Roman tradition and the East Indian tradition, where women as a subject of sculpture are both the desired and the powerful, the empowered, the earth goddess. But he's also aware of a controversy that swirled around one of the salons he participated in 1899. Auguste Rodin exhibits for the first time his sculpture of Eve, the original plaster of which is at the Maryhill Museum. There's all sorts of wonderful sort of loops back and forth. And from that plaster was made this bronze. And that plaster was exhibited in the Salon of 1899, a salon in which Lachaise participates while he's still in France. It was controversial because of her monumentality, her placement on the floor, and her evocation of emotion, of regret, of withdrawal. And so somewhere in this model, Lachaise, who references this in letters, who talks about it, began to develop, with Isabel as his model, a series of studies of the female nude. Draped, these come undoubtedly out of the morning ritual in her dressing gown, as well as Ruth St Denis costumes. And so you see in this series of studies these small scale, and they vary from about 9 inches to 14 inches, series of studies he makes in plaster and clay, which were after his death cast in bronze. And this series of sculpture attracts the attention of a number of people, fellow artists who see them, who think that there's a radical dislocation of, even for a study, of a figure that is becoming abstract. And so in this group, there is the work that he exhibits in the famous 1913 Armory exhibition. And that is the figure on your left, the woman with the coat. And it is the piece that was chosen by the Artists Committee to be included in that show. But I get ahead of the narrative. This group of sculptures he makes during the course of about 6 years. Starting with the sculptures of Rue St Denis, he begins to let go of detail. He begins to then work at the abstraction. It is the massing of this figure that I think is really intriguing, because you see the base of the modeling, the way he pulls up into the legs, that he then pulls out to the breast and the shoulders, and then pulls into the head. It shows very early how the head becomes slightly smaller than the body. It's not a classical proportion. It is a proportion that is, I think, subliminally driven, and it's this archetype of the animus of the heroic woman, the goddess, and the way that she looms above us, and we're always somehow diminished by her. I should point out that Isabel in her prime was 5'2" and 106 pounds. It's just where you put the 106 pounds. Because it's rumored that she only weighed about 110 in this photo. But it's this sense about the way the artist making art is a moment in which the inspiration and the experience of the world is processed. And in 1912, 1907, 1915, we're still defining what that secondary filter is, that is the psychological, the emotional, and how it would become manifest in the work of art. And in these studies, you see him progressively pulling the figure into this kind of power, into the most powerful gesture he can. A looming figure, looming over him, dominating the viewer, even in this small scale. And I've arranged the exhibition so you can see a 10-year cycle of these studies all together. And it helps, I think, to begin to focus it. All of these are moving toward the resolution of what would become his first great monumental sculpture, Elevation. This work, which dates from 1912 to 1915, was finished in New York. In 1912, Kitson moves his studio to New York. He has a major sculpture in New York he needs to do, so he moves his sculpture there. He's finished the Boston Civil War monuments that he was doing, and he decides he has to move, so he moves his studio. Lachaise asks Isabel's permission to move. Interesting cycle there. It will come later. In a Jungian kind of way. And he moves then his studio and himself to New York in 1912. And they begin visiting. She takes the commuter in, and the train in, and they have weekends in New York. And he begins to work in Kitson's studio in New York. He rapidly finds Kitson's lack of progressive ideas and rejection of modernism antithetical, and he moves to John Manship's studio as an assistant, because Manship is starting to get public commissions, and he needs a mold maker. He needs someone to help him. And Lachaise, who has that classical Beaux-Arts training, embraces that and comes and moves with him. And this introduces him to a whole series of patrons who are interested in the emerging development of Cubism, of post-impressionist painting, and the kind of post-Rodin sculpture that begins to be developed in Europe. It's essential to understand that Lachaise, through a series of flukes and circumstances and need, continuously finds himself at the edge of, or the virtual center of, the avant-garde in American art of this period. And so it is with Elevation that he resolves the first element of the motif of woman with a capital W. There's a moment in his letters about 1914-15 when he begins to capitalize the word woman. And it is to signify his search for a universal, an archetypal woman who can embody history's, the historical sense of woman as goddess, as earth, as sky, as sun, as the power of life and being in the world. And he begins to talk about it in his letters and in the work. And so in Elevation, you see in very real way the body of Isabel transformed. You see her literally elevated on tiptoe. So that he lifts the lightness of her, not unlike the barefoot dancers of modernism, Isabel Denis and Sarah Bernhardt, Loie Fuller. There is this sense of lifting up. And then the body is a series of S-curves side to side so that the hips are cocked slightly by the positioning of the feet. And then the breast and the upper torso is tilting in a counter movement, a la the sculpture of India, and back slightly, so that the breasts present themselves, but pride presents itself. Power presents itself. And the shoulders, which are back, lift the arms forward. And the arms are an interesting gesture. They begin to draw the viewer to the face, and the hand here beginning to be this gesture of welcome or control. A very interesting, almost dance-like, ballet-like sense of the hands, the way the fingers cup, the way they curl, the way they open up so that each finger has an articulation, as if there's going to be movement. The kind of dance movement that you see in East Asian dance, the way Indian sculpture articulates it. Greek sculptures, remember, the hands tend to be unitary. They tend to be near the body. They don't tend to lift. So this is a very different gesture. The face, the eyes are closed or heavily lidded. It is partly, this is something that Isabel had. When you see photographs of her face, her eyes were heavily lidded. She looked at the world through partial screening. And so there is a serenity and a self-containment expressed in the face. It increases the sense of power, of aloofness, of lifting above. And when you see the work in the sculpture, it's one of the first major sculptures you see in the exhibition, because it's very early, it's 1912. This work, which was eventually exhibited in, let's see, when it was exhibited at the Bourgeois Gallery in 1918 in New York, and attracted immediate critical response. It is a moment, interestingly enough, in which Lachaise has become an American citizen. He never returns to France once he comes to Boston. His family visits him on 2 occasions. His widowed mother and sister come to America. They bring news. There's a continuous correspondence with Europe. 1916, Isabel finally lets go of George and his bank account. And in 1917, Lachaise first becomes a citizen, and then 2 months later marries Isabel, and takes on the cost of supporting the goddess he wishes to express in his work. My mother always told me old habits are hard to break. And so the summer house in Maine, the apartment on Fifth Avenue, the driver and the cook become Lachaise's problem. And he will scramble the rest of his adult life to sustain his beloved's lifestyle and to produce his work. This manifests itself in an interesting indirect way. Many of the bronzes that we know Lachaise's work best by are cast posthumously. They are filling out the editions that he set up when he was alive. He had opportunity to only cast, as many sculptors do in America up until the 60s, he only cast a bronze when he had a patron who would pay for it. And so lifetime casts are the first cast of an edition of 9 or 12. And so there are a handful of lifetime casts in the exhibition, and the rest we know through posthumous casts that Isabel would cast later, or the foundation would cast later, to realize what he had hoped. I mention this by way of the chauffeur, cook, apartment, house in Maine lifestyle that he now supported. He has his first one-person show. He sells a limited amount of work, but he is the toast of New York. He has one of the first profiles of a modernist sculptor in the New Yorker is written by Henry McBride, an art critic of the time. It would not be the first or only article on Lachaise, but it's an early one. It's hard to find nowadays. But Lachaise now has responsibility. Her son, Edward, is at Harvard. Lachaise contributes to his education, as well as continuing to, support his work. And he is now meeting, through Edward, a series of people. There are a series of advocates that change the course of Lachaise's life. We might get to surrealism. I'm holding out hope for surrealism. There are, on the screen now, 3 busts by Lachaise. Lachaise continues a traditional practice against the avant-garde experimentation. It is stylish, it is modern, in that it is semi-abstracted. The lines of care are gone, the surfaces become smooth, they become volumetric, they become like Brancusi, a series of volumes and conventions of representation. And so on the screen, at the left is a portrait bust of Henry McBride, the first critic who recognized his brilliance and who would become a friend after that. And so in 1928, Lachaise makes a bust of him, a robust, full-figured man of a certain age who is one of the defining voices of, critically, of modernism. Kind of a little like Holland Cotter or Michael Kemmelman today. He was writing for the daily papers and magazines. He was responding to the artists of the avant-garde, to the circle of Stieglitz and power. Next is E. Cummings, the poet, who is introduced to Lachaise by his classmate, Edward Nagel, the son of Isabel, who brought into Lachaise's life a series of people who would help change Lachaise's fortune. E. Cummings, the poet, dedicates poems to Lachaise, writes poems about Lachaise's work, and he becomes the editor of one of the early avant-garde magazines in New York that dealt with the new wave of poetry, theater, art, and music, The Dial magazine, which was published by the third gentleman on the right, Schofield Thayer, a Harvard graduate also, a scion of a wealthy family. He buys Dial magazine from its bohemian start, and he turns it into the most important intellectual journal of its day. The first edition has a Gaston Lachaise wall relief on the cover and a lead article by E. Cummings, who is hired as editor, about Lachaise and modernism, the symbolic and the physical. And so it is through these two gentlemen that the work of Lachaise begins to be more widely known outside of his circle of friends. And so it is in that cover and article in 1920 that things begin to happen. It's interesting to know that, and it attracts the attention of Alfred Stieglitz. I'd like to return, there is a moment when Lachaise moves to New York in 1912, early. 1912 is also the date when Jung comes back to America and spends 6 months in New York giving lectures at Fordham University, which become the book, The Theory of Psychoanalysis. I haven't found the proof yet that Lachaise is introduced to Jung, but one of the sponsors of the lectures at Fordham had his portrait bust done by Lachaise. Jung is feted by the avant-garde and the modernists of New York intelligentsia. His theories of psychoanalytic practice and dream analysis are the cocktail chatter of the avant-garde in New York in 1912. Jung comes back in 1924 through 25 and spends a year in New York and New Mexico. And so he intersects the Stieglitz group again at a critical point for Lachaise's development, and has thoroughly developed his notion of archetypes of these kind of overarching symbols or manifestations of personality that shape human interaction and consciousness. I go back to that because there is in the evolution of woman for Lachaise a series of movements toward that reveal themselves as the male power inside of woman, male identity inside of woman, and female identity inside of man, and its related psychoanalytic things. There is also the "Mother, may I move to New York" quality of the dominating mother that Isabel has inside of his life, through the hand gestures and the work that we'll see shortly. So Stieglitz, Isabel, and Gaston have frequented 209 Gallery. They have seen the modernists, and they become friends with Marsden Hartley, Arthur Dove. They see the early work of Picasso. They also see African sculpture. They see pre-Columbian work. They become involved. And at some point, Stieglitz commissions Lachaise to do his portrait in bronze and Georgia O'Keeffe's portrait in marble. And it is a half-length portrait, so it's, I don't have an image of it, I'm sorry. The Georgia O'Keeffe is in white marble. It is from her hands and her waist to the top of her head. Amazing work, and it took some 2 years to do. But this is the bronze. It is a moment at which, in the development of that Stieglitz begins to show Lachaise when he is in the phase of what I would call his extreme, the extreme edge of his modernist simplification. In a series of figures like this walking figure, the seated figure of 1918, the 1926 woman with her hands on her hips, you see Lachaise taking the naked figure of elevation, cloaking her in a kind of a universal jersey dress. And it reflects that moment at which the powerful woman takes her place inside of a social situation. Isabel and Gaston Lachaise are part of the Florine Stettheimer circle, which is Duchamp. And so all during the 20s and 30s, they are entertained on Park Avenue with the Stettheimer sisters. A salon that speaks French, that engages the early motifs of literary surrealism, of modernism, E.E. Cummings, and the poets and musicians of the day. It is there that he meets Lincoln Kirsten, who's brought as a visitor, and engages a dialogue with Duchamp about current events in Paris and the ideas of the French avant-garde that come to Paris through the Stettheimer Salon and the galleries of Stieglitz. And so you see, there is this milieu of ideas and influences, people and places that begin to work. And so in this work, you see the powerful woman, hands on hip, shoulders up. Notice the way the shoulders are beginning to become abstract elements. Look at the way they lift up and they become almost like shoulder pads or some kind of protection. It's because the shoulders are shifted forward. The breasts flatten and drop slightly. The arms are akimbo and against her hips. It's the open hand on the body revealing itself through the cloth, but still covered. It's a way of him dealing with it. At the same time, he's doing a series of reliefs. This is an absolutely exquisite marble relief, which doesn't transfer well. I'm sorry. With gilded hair, typical of the series of reliefs. He takes the universal woman, and she begins to float in an abstract space against the plaque or the relief panel. And so here, haloed like a Renaissance Madonna, holding her cape open, which forms this great arcing curve, half circle behind her, you see the figure presenting itself, the breast, the hips, the sense of fecundity, of power, of stepping out, of being otherworldly, away from us, does not engage us directly, not in the same way that this figure looks out at the world with eyes lidded. Internal but externalized power. It's an important motif inside of what he's doing. It is this time in 1921, just after his show with Stieglitz, that he gets his first public commission, and he does a series of reliefs at the American Telegraph and Telegram building in Manhattan. Those reliefs are still there. It is the life in summers Isabel would spend in Maine. He would visit from his studio. He would live in his studio downtown New York much of the time, and then weekends or long weeks in Maine, drawing Isabel, meeting with their friends, John Marin, Marsden Hartley, a series of modernists who were part of that. Here he helps her with her shoe. Gentlemanly to the extreme. There is another edge, of course, to the relationship with Isabel. And it is in the early 20s, mid-20s actually, so this is 1925. The same year he has his first one-person museum exhibition at the Art Institute of Chicago, which has always been sort of slightly, in a funny way, slightly ahead of New York in this period of recognizing the avant-garde. The first museum to really collect the post-impressionists, the first museum to collect Matisse and Picasso, the first city to show Dubuffet. They show Gaston Lachaise first, and they give him one-person show. Woman in a Chair. I love this one. It has sort of an edge to it, a psychological edge that says, martini? Over here, Gaston. It is woman in command, woman with a capital W, Isabel but not Isabel. There is something that happens inside of Lachaise's work as Isabel ages and he ages. She's 10 years older. When he's 20, she's 30. When he's 35, she's 45. Her body, which was in full blossom when he met her, becomes like a late summer rose, and it just folds. It's fulsomeness. It's a nice metaphor. And so, she begins to, the sedentariness that takes over when gravity has us in its hold, becomes part of the motif, and it also then sends him into his mind, and he begins to draw from her less, to literally drawing her as she sits and reclines and talks and moves on the beach. He has photographs, he has memories. She has become the universal for him. She has become the embodiment of historic art and the present, dance and the present. He does a series of commissions. And she very rapidly, there is the memory of their passion and the need to express and to share that passion. And so the kiss, his variant on a motif that we remember from Rodin, the figure the male figure collapsing against the breast of the woman, sharing a kiss, or the tender holding of the body. Here, the passion of this, the bodies turning to reveal themselves. At the same time, the heads are focused intently on themselves, their eyes closed. They are lost in their reverie. the body and the molding begins to be more physical. It moves in this arc from the experimental standing figures to the sophistication and finish and polish of elevation with the hands, to the walking women in the jersey dresses, to this moment when, in the 20s, he begins to make them physical. He begins to push the edges of them. The figures become more emotionally abstracted, less materially and continuous form modeling that allows them then to become something else. Here's Lachaise in his studio with elevation behind him, a series of portrait heads silhouetted against the window. He himself has found gravity and maturity. He was also 5'4". She's 5'2", she's 5'4". So he's a short, stocky guy. He moves to a moment when abstraction is pulling him. That figure which had the grace of a dancer becomes the fullness and the powerful voice of an archaic goddess. And in this work from 1927, which, when you see the exhibition, you realize is monumental. She's close to 10 and a half feet from tip to tip, from toe to finger. He shows first in plaster in Stieglitz's gallery, the Intimate Gallery. Overwhelming the room, overwhelming the visitor, she becomes this goddess. There's something very interesting in the hands. Notice the way they present themselves, open-palmed, lifting slightly. It's a gesture he sees in Cypriot sculpture from the ancient world, that he has found in some of the reliefs of Indian sculpture at the Metropolitan. But it is also one of his universal gesture of presentation, of acceptance, of intoning the spirit. The head looks up, mask-like, without hair. It is a figure reduced to its essential volumes, a la Brancusi, but it's also something more. The body's sensuousness, the legs twisting into a braid like a DNA struggle, the ankles curled. It's, I'm not sure with those thighs I'd try to do this, but it's very yoga-like. But I think also owes a debt to the growing awareness in the avant-garde of African sculpture and the way that the volumes of the body are analyzed in formal terms inside of African sculpture, where each of the body's forms, the torso, the breast, the arms, the legs, the thighs, the feet, all become a certain kind of geometric shape. Notice the way the torso sits in, is like set into the hips. The hips then universally become the thighs, which then disappear at the knee into the leg, and it extends out. And so that there's kind of this volume that solidifies the figure as it sits, suspended in air, and then extends out to the extremities. It is a gesture of welcome, a gesture of benediction. It is also a presentation gesture. I am here, I am woman, I am the goddess you have sought. And it is in that notion that you see Lachaise reveling, and that people responded to it. As Marsden Hartley would say, Lachaise has followed his aesthetic demon like a true artist, and that demon was perfection, ideality, the reality of the ideal experience of life first all. He was a romantic, a lyric architect of human form who saw the entire universe in the form of a woman. Marsden Hartley, a great American painter represented in our collection and certainly in this show, saw in Lachaise's work this universalizing, this seeking the ideal, this way of finding the body, just at the moment that Lachaise is beginning to take the body and invent something new. The doctors will recognize that flattened pelvis, but this is the back of the figure. It's in polished bronze. Notice the way the articulation of the deltoids, the shoulders rotating back as the arms would go up, that kind of nipped waist, that kind of wasp's nest waist narrowness, this kind of extreme in which the volumes of the trunk and the torso and the pelvis are reduced to these two forms. It is a moment, interesting, 1930, when Edward Weston is photographing peppers and finding inside his photographs the female form. It's a moment when, by extension, the still lifes of Marsden Hartley become personalities. It is this metaphorical moment at which the body finds its parallels and its echoes in artists' use of nature and form. And Lachaise is there pushing his paradigm further. He continues to develop in the 30s with the support of a series of patrons, including John D. Rockefeller, Walter Chrysler, Morgan Frick. They've all purchased Lachaise works as leaders of the avant-garde. He pushes forward with Woman. The sculpture court is 3 monumental works. Woman. Here, the elevation has taken on a new weight, a new presence, a new commanding sensibility. This figure's eyes are open. It looks down at the world from on high. Its volumes masterfully rendered, extreme, but not as extreme as it would become, because in the studio there's a whole body of work that is not being exhibited until late in the mid-30s. Here, man. Lincoln Kirsten, the founder of the American Ballet Theater, commissions Lachaise to do a portrait of himself, and so he does both a bust and a full figure. G.L.K. Morris, an artist who's represented in our collection with an abstract painting in the Jubit Center, also commissions a portrait. Morris is playing tennis. He was something of a dandy and a painter, a dilettante painter. And Lincoln Kirsten is presented prideful as a young buck can be, naked, walking into the space. Lachaise believed that portraiture was always about revealing the self, and that it should be naked. And Kirsten went along, and so there's this spectacular bronze there are 2 copies of it, one in New York and one in Tennessee. And this figure, in which he begins to sort out, how does he feel about the male body? How does the male body, the man who contains this Jungian idea of the female inside, and woman, who contains the power and the kind of spirit of man inside her femininity, how do these figures articulate themselves? He's only beginning. This is created 1930, 1934. It stays in his studio as a plaster. It is, as you can tell, monumental. The hands and the feet, like the David in Florence, are exaggerated. The head is small. It is the figure muscled and trying to become something else. Lachaise in 1934-35 says, I'm finally beginning to understand what man is, how man becomes sculpture. He never does a self-portrait. He never looks in the mirror. He always looks out. He always looks out and searches for woman. It's a very interesting notion about how he finds himself in another way. And so the trajectory I've taken you from is this ever larger arc toward the ultimate statement of what is woman, what is the archetypal woman, the archetypal man. Lachaise, in the privacy of his studio at the same time, is beginning to develop from the mid-20s on a series of extremely abstracted and reduced figurative works. And he is doing it in response to the noise around psychoanalytic theory, the subconscious, the fragmentary music of modernism, and the early leitmotifs of surrealism. And it is in that juncture of ideas that Lachaise begins to take apart this ideal he has finally realized, this woman as all-powerful goddess and vision and passion. He begins to pull it apart, to begin to look at the edges of that experience and that notion. And he creates, I maintain, and I've been asked to write an article about it, that he anticipates surrealism as inside of figurative sculpture, in a way that the surrealists and the Dadaists do not in Europe. And their work is characterized by the subversion of the familiar, like this fur teacup by Merritt Oppenheim, which is called Object. It comes out of a conversation she has with Picasso at the Dumago on the Boulevard Saint-Germain, when she said, any object can take on new meaning. A cup, water, fur. And she goes back to her studio and she creates this object which subverts the cup and saucer and spoon, but reinvents it in a psychologically charged, subliminal dream image kind of way. And so this becomes, sadly for Merritt Oppenheim, who's really pretty interesting as a series of poems and sculptures, her most famous object. And then there's the other way is to take the mannequin head and the machine. And so this work by Raoul Hassmann, also an early surrealist, from 1920, it's called Mechanical Head. It takes the notion of the spirit of our time, the machine, and it weds it to the human image. These are not images that are modeled. These are not images that reflect the internal dialogue of the figure and the sculptor's relationship to it in the way that Gaston Lachaise has. They're works that try and take that notion that the chairs get up and dance in the middle of the night when we're asleep and give it new form. It is the surrealism of Salvador Dali, in which the world is distorted around us by our imagination and dream, and therefore takes on an emotional base. As opposed to Lachaise, who begins to see in the process of the emotional reality of aging, of the body going. In this work called Extremis, the female figure kneeling, head thrown back, looking at the sky, the sternum and the bones of the body beginning to emerge from the body, just as the breasts have fallen to the side, the far sides of her body. That this kind of collapse back is an extreme vision of age. It is we see it both as a reflection of this thing that we can experience as our bodies change, but we see in our partners and our lovers change happening. But it is also this psychological, as if the generative force of life is falling away and the essential, the skeleton of who we are or what we seek is lifting forward. It is this kind of extreme vision that Lachaise then begins to work toward. Just as he was making these big classical monumental sculptures, he finally has the money and the stability financially to create 9-foot bronzes and 12-foot high bronzes, and to realize work because of a series of commissions at Rockefeller Center, at the International Building, in the work he does in new buildings as a muralist and relief sculptor of choice. He has these public commissions that are funding his independent work. And he begins to look at the figure and to look at the archetype of woman, of man, of birth, death, the transitions and the transformative events of life, their psychological and emotional impact. And using the body and this kind of classic notion of woman that he does. And so here you have the figure truncated, fragmented, lifting off one leg as if to move forward. No, there's no sense of who it is. He loses Isabel in a sense, but he retains essentially Isabel with her voluptuousness and her amplitude, and it becomes then psychologically charged. And these works, I maintain, are some of the most psychologically powerful and surreal figurative sculpture made in the 20th century, and they have not been understood that way because surrealism is basically a movement of the transformed object and the painting, the distortion of Salvador Dali, of Picasso's surreal beach figures where they run pulling breasts and fragmented and shattered just before the war. Here, the pudendum and the breasts take on a life of their own, the body reduced to a sense of the source of life and the sustenance of life, the passion and the regeneration. And they take on a power not unlike a fraught dream that one comes to at the end of a long night of tossing and turning or becoming. They are, in their liberation from the body, a new statement. This is very interesting because this is not unlike, if you remember that Lakshmi Indian sculpture I showed of the dancer with the almost independent melon-like breasts. Here the breasts become the source from which the figure lifts. The hands, this kind of gesture, the seeking of perfection, as if she's holding up this perfect note. Rodin comes to this kind of extreme of the fragmentation of the body late in his life. And Lachaise, in 1934, finds this voice at a time when surrealism is just becoming defined in its terms pictorially, and yet to find it in a physical way. The Dynamo Mother, I think, is one of the most complex because he's taken that extreme. Do you remember the shoulders that became these kind of pointed up on that jersey-clad woman with her hands on her hip? There was kind of pointed shoulders. Here, the body extremes are pulled to the points. The hands, the feet, and the nipples of her breasts become these pendant spikes as this figure holds its legs spread so that the source of life, the pudenda, is extended extremely. And the body becomes a mass. It is the earth mother, the dynamo mother, the devouring mother in Jungian terms. This woman who gives us life and takes life, who demands our obsequiousness and our commitment, and it's all through her power as the source of being that he celebrates and questions. It is that sense of the final realization, I think, final because he will die in 35, that he finds in this expression through the body, through woman as metaphor and ideal, this sense of what happens, how the life force comes from and is consumed by this being. It is against the kind of coolness of Giacometti in this seated figure, a female form. This is not Lachaise. This is what's happening in Europe at that moment. Or after Lachaise, a woman with her throat cut by Giacometti, in which the extremes of the figure are reduced to a skeleton. The rib cage, the neck, the head on the extreme right, its mouth open, the breasts on the profile of the belly as it comes down to the legs that are bent. Extreme abstraction, but without the sense of this life force. Because much of what Lachaise sought to portray was through the archetype of the woman who captured his imagination as an 18-year-old, who nurtured him and directed him, dominated him and inspired him. He seeks to find, ultimately, the psychological and emotional power of woman in all of her force. And so one of the last works he creates is La Montagne, the mountain. this is truly, in all sorts of terms, intellectually and physically, the earth as the mother of life, woman as the source of power and the breath of life. A mountainous form, the perimeter of a life, the horizon of all of us. And she lives in this form, the silvered bronze upstairs, originally commissioned by G.L.K. Morris for his estate. The mountain was shown in plaster at the Museum of Modern Art in 1935. The first sculptor honored by the Museum of Modern Art with a one-person show that filled the building. Gaston Lachaise, before Rodin, before Brancusi, before Giacometti, honored as the leading modernist of his age, an artist who embraced through the figure the archetypes of psychoanalytic theory, of music, and a cross-cultural current. Brilliant, complicated, and present. That's the work of Gaston Lachaise. Thank you.